Welcome to the shop, my friend. Steve here at SKS Props, and in today's build video I've got a project that's a little bit different, and that's because after putting together Boba Fett's blaster and his pistol, both which are insanely detailed and incredibly intricate, I wanted to make something that was a little more organic and forgiving. So I determined now's the time to put together Boba Fett's Mythosaur skull, and I want to utilize this sculpture as a wall hanging in my shop. Because of that, it needs to be light. So this entire skull is made completely out of my HD foam and foam clay, both which can be found over at Blick Art Materials. And foam is a great material for a project like this because it's easy to cut, it's easy to sand. I can stipple it and detail it using a wood burner, and then I can utilize foam clay on top to give it that additional sculpture dimension. But building it is one thing, and if you would like to build one of these, I of course have free PDF files over on my website that you can download to build right along with me, but it's the paint job that sells this skull. Now you guys know me, I absolutely love painting, and the multi-layered paint steps that go into bringing this skull to life really do give it that additional level of detail. So I want to show you what it takes to put this skull together and paint it. Let's go ahead and get started. I created a template in Photoshop and I cut out all the pieces, and to start off I'm going to transfer part A onto some 10mm foam. And one of the great things about my foam being light gray is that I can draw directly on it just using a pencil. Part B is going to bulk out the nose and the forehead of the skull. This is also traced and cut out of some 10mm foam. Using some weldwood contact cement, part A and part B can be glued together. Now at the nose the pieces can just line up, but at the top of the skull I want them to have a slight curve. So I start by slightly curving part A and then press part B onto it while it's curved. Part C is going to go above the eyes, so I transfer and cut out this piece out of some 6mm foam. This will give the skull a tiered effect. Part C can now be glued to the skull, and if there's a small gap between part B and part C, that's no problem because I'm going to fill this with foam clay later on. Now I'm going to take the template for part D, which is going to go below the eyes, and I'm going to transfer that onto some 4mm foam. The great thing about this template is everything is organic, so it's easy to cut out. Part E is going to go behind the skull, and this is going to give it a little bit of dimension. This piece is traced and cut out of some 6mm foam. Part F is going to make up the lower part of the skull and is cut out of 10mm foam. For the skull's teeth, I'm going to transfer parts G, H, and I onto some 10mm foam and cut those out. Now for part J, you're going to notice in the video it's 2 pieces, but on your template it's 1. And that's because while I'm building this, I'm constantly refining the template to make it easier to build for you. For his horns, I'm going to cut part K out of some 10mm foam. Now I'm only going to cut out 2 right now for mock-up, but I'm going to need an additional 2 later on for layering. Before all these pieces get glued together, I'm going to go in with a smooth sanding drum on my Dremel rotary tool and refine all the edges. This process is going to give the skull a more organic feel, but notice I can start to cut in and refine these areas quite a bit, especially at the top of the forehead and the bridge of the nose. And that's why using 10mm foam is important, because it gives me enough material that it's easy to manipulate. I also go ahead and refine all the pieces that go behind the skull and each one of his teeth. I do a light heat treatment on all the pieces before they get glued together. Notice on part E I have some guidelines, and that's so I can easily line it up once I glue it to the back of the skull. I trace around part F on the back of the skull just to make sure that the placement of this piece is correct. Now I'm going to glue on part J, and remember on the template your piece is longer than what you're seeing in the video. Now each one of the teeth can be glued on, and I glue each one of these to the bottom of the skull with a little bit of super glue. Once the front 4 have been put into place, part I can then be glued behind part H. Part H and part G also have a slight overlap, and then the front 2 teeth can be glued together. And this is what I was talking about earlier when I figured out the upper section for part J. Now I can take part L and glue it slightly back on the upper sections of the skull. Again, by doing all this, it gives it a tiered appearance. That way when it's hanging on a wall, it has a more 3-dimensional look. With the skull complete, I can start to work on the horns. And you can see here where part K is going to glue to the back of the skull, and the upper section of part J is going to glue onto that to secure it into place. So now that I have 4 of the horn templates cut out, they can be glued together. And notice that I mark the inside of each so that I don't get them mixed up. Weldwood contact cement is once again used for the main section of these horns, and I put a little bit of Bob Smith super glue around the perimeter. These halves are then firmly pressed together, and then I check them for fit and I start to mark out where they're going to need to be sanded. Because I have to remove a lot more material on these horns, I go ahead and take them over to my sanding station. I start to round over the sides to give it a gradual curve, and then I can use the side of the sanding drum to start to cut into the foam. Now these details at the top of the horn still look pretty flat, but I'm going to build them up with some foam clay later on. With both horns refined, they can now be glued to either side of the skull. And on the back, you can see where part J overlaps onto them just a little bit, but enough to secure them into place. For the raised areas on the horns, the teeth, and his forehead, I'm going to be using some of my foam clay. This material is perfect for organic details, because it's really easy to sculpt or shape with my fingers or silicone tip tools. Now when working with foam clay, the first thing you need to do is wet the surface of the foam with a little bit of water. This water will help the foam clay stick to the foam and it won't easily pull off. Once I have blobs of the foam clay pretty much where I want, I can then switch over to my tools to start to refine the shapes. So here you can see I'm using foam clay to fill in the gap at the side of the horn and then building up the base. Now remember, with foam clay it does shrink a little bit, so you need to always have more than you're anticipating. Plus I'm a subtractive sculptor, so I like to put on more than I'm going to need, and then I can sand it off once it's dry. And for all of our layered sections that had gaps, I can now take foam clay and roll it out really thin, and then press it into the gaps to give it a better transition. If the clay sticks out too much, it reacts really well with water, so just wet your fingers and you can smooth it out. Foam clay is also used to easily bulk up sections, so I knew that these ridges at the top of the forehead were going to be a little tough to make out of just foam. But the foam clay is a great alternative to give it a more three-dimensional look. I decided that I want some detailing material behind the nose, so I'm going to take part M and transfer it onto some 6mm foam. With part M in place, I can now fill the nasal cavity with additional foam clay. And again, to get that organic look, I'm just using silicone tip tools. So foam clay itself takes about a day to dry, and after it is dry, I can then go in with a sanding sponge and start to refine the shapes. Now that I've got more material at the base of the horns, I can go in with the side of my sanding drum and cut it in deeper. Now sanding drums like this take away foam clay very easily, so be careful not to remove too much material. Switching over to a small stone bit, this will allow me to create detail lines that are quite a bit sharper. Now there's no real rule for this, just like battle damage, you just kind of want to look at the piece and see where it would be visually interesting. To give the skull some light striations, I use a wire brush gently on the surface. Now Boba's skull has that iconic mark at the top, so I draw it on using my template and then remove it with the sanding drum. I want this skull to have a lot of detailed lines and various pits, and to do that I'm going to be using my heat tool. But remember, when heating foam, you always wear a respirator. Using a pencil, I drew on where I wanted the ridge lines to be, and then following that I'm very lightly pressing into the foam. Depending on your heat, you could easily scorch it, so be careful. This detail tip was also used to help accent some of the detail lines that I had put into the skull earlier. The tool was also used to help clean up the mark at the top of the skull. Because it's freezing here in the Midwest, I'm going to be using Creature Cast, which is a brush-on neoprene rubber. The thing that's nice about it is that it's really thin, so the first layer I put down, or the print layer, is brushed on with a chip brush. After that, I can add a thickener to it for layer 2 and to help stipple on some additional textures. After the creature cast had been allowed to dry, I could then spray on a base layer of Krylon Red Oxide Primer. After the primer is dry, I can then apply a wash of Liquitex Heavy Body Unbleached Titanium. This is going to be applied with a 1-inch mop brush and a lot of water. After it's applied, I use a damp paper towel to mop up a lot of it. This is prepping the surface for additional layers of paint. Now I can dry brush some more unbleached titanium on top, making sure to let some of that red show through. For a dark wash, I'm going to be using some Mars Black, Raw Umber, and Burnt Sienna. This mixture is applied using the same mop brush, but varying the amounts of water depending on where it's applied to the skull. So here you can see I've let the paint darker in some of the recesses. And you guys know me, I love my paint layers, so an additional layer of unbleached titanium is dry brushed onto the highlight areas. Now the skull's looking pretty good, but I'd like it to have some additional hues, so I'm going to make a warmer wash using bronze yellow and raw sienna. This wash is really going to start giving it that whole warm, bone-like appearance, and notice that I'm not putting this in the deepest, darkest recesses. After the watery mixture is applied, I then wipe off a good portion of it with a damp paper towel. For the next dry brushing layer, I'm going to add a little bit of parchment to the unbleached titanium. Here I'm being a lot more selective about just adding it to the highlighted areas. As a final highlight layer, I add straight parchment to certain sections of the skull. Now with the last two layers, I don't add any water because I don't want this running down into the crevices. And as you can see, after multiple layers, we got a pretty good bone finish going on. To accentuate some of the details, I switch over to a liner brush and I use the paint combination that I used earlier on. This is painted down into the ridge details and some of the deeper cracks that are on the skull. And this is a great example of how you can have a piece that's not completely three-dimensional, but your paint application can make it have more depth.
So you all can see the steps that I took to put together my own Boba Fett Mythosaur skull. And remember, if you would like to build your own, I have free files available over on my website that you can download and build right along with the video. And if you are building any of my builds or utilizing some HD foam, be sure to tag me at SKS Props on Twitter and Instagram because I want to see your creations. Until next time, build your best with the best. HD foam.